Good morning, YouTubers. Today we're going to look at the classic educational game, Oregon Trail. Depending on your age and where you grew up, you probably had the opportunity to play this in school. This was one of the early prime examples of computers being used by elementary children for educational purposes. And having played the game growing up in the 1980s, I can say it was also a lot of fun, and playing it on the Apple II was one of the reasons I became fascinated with computers and electronics in general. The game itself was developed by the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium, or Corporation, depending on which year it was. They were better known to kids as MECC. The company was formed in 1973 with the purpose of providing computer services to schools in Minnesota. But why Minnesota? That seems a little random, doesn't it? Well, Minnesota was actually home to offices and facilities for tech companies such as Honeywell and IBM. Because of the tech presence there, a new program was introduced in 1963 to provide computer access to classrooms across the state. The program began by connecting to a General Electric computer at Dartmouth College via the phone lines. Connecting computers via the phone lines, I wonder if that idea would stick around. The purpose was to have the opportunity to use what would eventually be basic programming language. At the time, it was simply referred to as Dartmouth Basic. This programming language was designed by Thomas Kurtz and John Kimity and would be used as part of the Dartmouth time-sharing program. The programs ran on a GE235 and GEDN30 computer. By 1968, Total Information for Educational Systems, or TIES, was formed by 20 school districts in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area and the University of Minnesota College of Education. The organization's purpose was to provide training, software, and time-sharing services on an HP 2000 computer. The organization also got a boost due to many of the local school boards having members who also worked in the computer industry there. All these factors happen to make Minnesota a leader in computer-based education. By the early 70s, the need arose to expand TIE's role from just serving the Minneapolis school systems to the entire state of Minnesota. So, in 1973, the Minnesota State Legislature formed the Minnesota Educational Computer Consortium. The primary role of MECC, as they were better known as, was to study and coordinate computer usage in conjunction with the Minnesota Department of Education, the University of Minnesota, and the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities system. MECC initially served as both a provider and overseer of schools' computer services and expenses. After studying the educational needs of each school, MECC thought a central computer center in Minneapolis would best cater to their needs. This central computer center would be connected to every school in the state. This is a UNIVEC 1100 series model computer. MECC used this type of computer as their original mainframe. At the time, this was an advanced machine with 64K of memory. In comparison, NASA also used this same model, but from what I understand, NASA's was just slightly different. Despite its advanced status, this computer actually failed to meet the standards MECC was looking for, and they stopped using it in 1977. While it did perform batch processing adequately, it failed to meet their time-sharing goals and thus was replaced with a Cyber 73 mainframe from Control Data Corporation. Upon acquiring it, MECC was now home to the largest educational time-sharing system in the world. This thing connected 2,000 terminals throughout Minnesota and could execute up to 448 simultaneous connections at a time. In 1978, MECC reached a deal with Apple Computers that involved Apple selling any Minnesota school Apple II computers through MECC without the schools having to go through complicated and lengthy purchasing procedures.
My Apple is my manager.
There are more people in more places doing more things with Apples than with any other personal computer in the world.
Apple Computer. Produktion, Kontrolle ohne den Apple? Unmöglich.
And of all these people using Apples, most had never touched a computer before.
This is my Apple.
Apple, the most personal computer.
Within 3 years, Apple had sold Minnesota schools over 2,000 computers, and by 1983, that number had reached 5,000. This made MECC Apple's largest reseller. MECC not only provided Minnesota schools with at-cost computers, but also with training and consortium consultants who traveled from school to school. By the early 80s, MECC had already established distributing programs to schools via diskettes or by allowing them to be downloaded through their time-sharing network. Starting in 1980, MECC began selling licenses for software usage to other departments of education and school districts around the world. Within the first year, 5,000 school districts had purchased licenses, and by 1982, MECC had sold more than 250,000 copies of its software. They had become so successful that by 1983 the state subsidies ended and MECC officially became a for-profit, taxable company, technically still owned by the state of Minnesota, but still an independent body. It was at this time that MECC's computer system contained nearly 1,000 different computer programs in its library collection, all of which were accessible to schools across Minnesota via a direct circuit connection and distributed to the thousands of others on disks. Of the nearly 1,000 different computer programs in 12 different computer languages, one individual program was being used by the network's users more than any other. Since 1971, Oregon Trail has been used by students as a teaching tool about the harsh life of pioneers in 19th century America, and in its time, it was an astounding success. The game's origin started at Carleton College in Minnesota when senior Don Rawich was student teaching an 8th grade history class. Rawich wanted to create a way to engage his students better, so he enlisted the help of fellow teachers Paul Dillenberger and Bill Heineman to develop a computer program to do just that. Using an HP 2100 series computer, the trio began coding a program they soon dubbed the Oregon Trail. On December 3, 1971, Rawich debuted the program to his students, and it quickly became popular among the student body. Philip Bouchard was the project manager for the 1985 edition of the Oregon Trail. I had the opportunity to speak with him while making this video.
The original idea came from a young man named Don Rawich, and he was a student studying history and also going after his teaching credentials at the time. And he was doing his student teaching in Minneapolis in history, and he wanted to come up with some idea that would excite his students. So he had this idea of a board game based on Oregon Trail. Then when he told his two roommates about this idea, both of whom were also student teachers and who had a math background, they said, why don't you do that same idea as a computer game? So they quickly threw something together because they only had 2 weeks to do it and came up with a little game to play in that classroom. Don tested it out. It worked well. And then he put it aside for like 4 years. Then 1975, he pulled the idea out again and still had the code written out, uploaded it to the MECC timeshare system, which was a brand new timeshare system that was available to students and teachers all over the state of Minnesota. And that became the beginning of the very famous use of that game within Minnesota on the timeshare system.
Using the time-sharing system and the Minneapolis Public Schools network, they distributed the program to other schools across the state. By summer of '72, Rawich had deleted the original program from the network, but fortunately kept the printed source code. In 1974, Rawich began working for MECC and quickly recreated his popular Oregon Trail program for them via the printed source code. This time, however, he added events at each location that actual pioneers could have faced along the trail. Written records from actual pioneers provided the inspiration for this edition. Upon release on MECC's time-sharing network, the game quickly developed thousands of players monthly, making it one of the most popular programs on the network. 1978 became a pivotal year for both the Oregon Trail program and MECC itself. It was then that Rawich published the source code for the Oregon Trail in the popular computer magazine Creative Computing. Since the program was written in BASIC, it became easy for most computer hobbyists to replicate themselves. That year, MECC also began encouraging schools to adapt the new Apple II computer, released the year before. To add an incentive for schools to do this, Apple launched a time-sharing network they dubbed Apple, or Apple Puget Sound Program Library Exchange. The Oregon Trail is one of the programs offered to schools as part of Apple's program package. Also in 1978, the Oregon Trail sequel was released, simply titled Oregon. J.P. O'Malley programmed this addition to the series.
That first Apple II version was the one that spread outside of Minnesota because the timeshare version was only available to students and teachers within Minnesota. That one was actually one of several games on a product called Elementary Volume 6, I believe it was. But the fame of this game spread far and wide. The problem was that by 1984, it was completely out of date technologically because all the products that anybody created in '84 were done by amateurs, amateur programmers, amateur designers, and the world had completely changed by 1984. Everything that by that date was being done by professional designers, professional programmers. Furthermore, our techniques had evolved. Even though we were still using an Apple II, we had learned how to do, not just us, but everybody in the industry had learned how to do much more sophisticated looking products. Finally, the other thing was that MECC decided it was time to get into the home market. And they wanted to go into the home market with a really great product. So they said, okay, it's time to replace this old Oregon II game. Let's take that concept and run with it, something much bigger. And I was lucky enough to be the one put in charge of leading that effort.
It wouldn't be until 1985 that the Oregon Trail edition known to most students would take off. This Oregon Trail edition had improved graphics and gameplay compared to previous versions. It was this edition many kids growing up in the 80s would look forward to during computer lab. It was here that you create a pioneer party of you and your friends, and where you'd point out when one of them died of dysentery.
We had a different designer on the project for the first 3 weeks, and her background was as an English teacher. So naturally, she was going at it from the standpoint of how can we use this in English instruction. So she was looking at it primarily from the standpoint of, let's do an activity where you're reading diaries of people who actually took the journey. It was an intriguing idea, but it didn't really work with our goal of creating this home market product that would be really exciting. It sounded more like a school market product. So when I was put in charge of this particular design, I had a very strong and extensive background in designing simulations. I had done that throughout graduate school. Oregon Trail really was a simulation. Even the original timeshare one was a simple stripped-down simulation with a set of 7 or 8 basic parallel mathematical formulas that were used to update state variables every 2 weeks. That aspect had a lot in common with all the stuff I'd been doing in grad school. So I decided, okay, I'm going to really build on that. I'm going to make a much more elaborate, much more detailed and nuanced simulation model with lots and lots of various state variables. Each one is described by a set of mathematical formulas.
The game starts you off in 1848, Independence, Missouri, and gives you the option of setting what time of year to start your journey. If you start out late in the year, you'll end up traveling in winter and likely getting stuck in the snow, but it makes crossing rivers easier. You also get the option of what type of occupation your team leader is, either farmer, carpenter, or banker. Each option provides you with a different amount of money to start out with, which you'll need to buy everything you'll take with you on the trail, and I mean everything, from the wagon parts to the oxen to clothes and food. If you have ammunition, you can hunt for extra food during the game.
Hunting was in there right from the start, as you pointed out. In the text version, you would have to type bang when told to do so. And then in a later version, they expanded that where you wouldn't know what they would ask you to type. It might be bang, pow, or something else. Then when the first Apple version came out, it was still mostly a text game, but it had 2 places in the game where there were graphics. And one was a hunting game, where you could shoot at a slowly animated deer moving across the screen. They also had animated shooting at other things. You could shoot at a wolf who was attacking you, or you could shoot at bandits who were attacking you, or you could shoot at hostile riders who were attacking you. One of my decisions early on was I got rid of all these attacks and just kept the hunting aspect. But then to appeal to girls, I wanted to do a number of things. First of all, I wanted to be able to make it possible to get to Oregon without hunting if you really wanted to. If you started with enough money and you made appropriate decisions along the way, you could get there without hunting if you wanted. I also wanted to make sure that the game appealed to different learning styles and different game playing styles. So I tried to put in lots of different activities that would appeal to both genders, so that there would be a good mix of things for people, for kids, regardless of what kinds of games you like to play.
The entire journey comprises of about 16 segments spanning across 2,000 miles. The number of segments is based on which trail you take along the way. Throughout the game, you monitor the date, the weather, your group's health, the amount of food remaining, how many miles to the next landmark, and how many miles you've traveled total.
But one of the key aspects was the screen that you look at as you travel from landmark to landmark, which we call the travel screen. And we already had some clues that my travel screen might not be working too well when we tested it amongst ourselves before going to the kids. And sure enough, this beautiful scene of the prairie just wasn't engaging the kids. Nothing was moving. The only thing changing was the numbers on the screen. So we knew we had to change something, and we started brainstorming. It was primarily me and my 3 other principal team members. But as we were chatting, one of our colleagues walked up, a guy who wasn't even on the project. His name's Bill Way. He just kind of threw out an idea. He said, why don't you put a little wagon on there and have it, moving, animated across the screen? So we thought, yeah, let's give that a try. And starting with that idea, we had to make change after change after change in order to actually accommodate that idea and to optimize that idea. And by the time we were finished with all this long series of changes, we had a completely different travel screen, and it worked. It really worked quite well. And as you say, it became the iconic screen of the product, the de facto branding of the product.
At each landmark, you have the option of resting for a day or more. At each river, you have to choose how to cross it. Some rivers are shallow and are easy to just drive across. Deeper rivers require you to either caulk the wagon and float across, or in some instances, a ferry is available, but the ferries cost money. If you caulk the wagon and it tips over, you risk losing supplies and people. If you happen to drive across the deep river, you'll most certainly lose supplies and a member or 2 of your party. The game only ends if the leader dies or if you make it to Oregon. Along the trail, you can encounter other obstacles, such as bad weather and broken wheel axles. When you do finally reach Oregon, you have the option of floating down the Columbia River or taking the Barlow Toll Road.
The Barlow Toll Road was a particularly difficult route in real life. It was very steep, narrow. It was very hard to get the oxen and wagon over this pass. Some people would get mules instead to try to get their stuff over. People ended up having to use ropes and pulleys because they would have to frequently unhook the oxen from the wagons in order to pull the wagons up over slopes. They used levers to get them over ruts and rocks. All this seemed like a rich opportunity for some kind of game included in the product. I also very much like the idea that the product would have this grand finale where you have a choice of two different games to do the last 100 miles. One would be the rafting game, an action game. The other one would be this Barlow Toll Road game that was going to be essentially a puzzle game. How do I use these pulleys and ropes and levers in a way to successfully get over this mountain without breaking anything, without breaking the axles or wheel, without having the wagon run away from me and crash and destroy everything? I like that idea very much, but all throughout the product, I had to prioritize what's most important now, what's most important in this month, what's important next month. And there were several reasons that this particular module got deprioritized. One was that I was never sure that we would have a successful design for this module. Another one was that nothing else depended on it. It was the very last step in the game, and therefore we didn't have to develop it in order to test other things. And on. There were various reasons that kept getting deprioritized. And finally, we got to the point where, okay, this is not high enough priority to make it into the game at all. It's just going to have to get cut.
Most of MECC's products were written in AppleSoft Basic software. Some of the industry also refer to as Floating Point Basic, or FP Basic. Without getting into too many details, FP Basic was a successor to Integer Basic used in the first Apple computers. Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak had developed Integer Basic as its first operating system. However, it didn't support what's often referred to as floating point mathematics. Integer Basic was not adequate enough for programmers wanting to develop business software because it was limited with processing mathematical integers longer than 9 decimal places. This limited it for more complex software requiring more complex math. For software of any kind to actually handle complex mathematics, it requires the ability to compute code with floating point numbers. The floating point represents a real number from a mathematical expression, such as 1.2345 equals 12345 times 10 to the negative 4 base power. And honestly, this kind of math is not my strong suit, so I'll finish with that note. But basically, Integer Basic did not compute with programs that required that kind of math. To accommodate programmers, Apple struck a deal with Microsoft to license their BASIC to use in Apple IIs. MECC also used assembly language to write their programs. Assembly language is programming code that allows the programmer to use names instead of numbers to represent commands in software. This is important because without it, the only way to write computer code would be with numbers. To create programs with graphics and decent playability, MECC would often use both types of programming code to develop their software.
By that time, we were no longer doing any of our products in 100% AppleSoft because it just limited us too much. We could not do professional-looking products strictly in AppleSoft. So what we were doing is that we were using a set of tools, primarily a set of tools that allowed us to make better use of the high-res screen. It allowed us to put text of any style and any size on any place on the screen. It allowed us to put block graphics, color block graphics of any arbitrary rectangular size on the screen and to place them. Tools like this were very important. So we created in assembly language a set of subroutines that would allow us to do that for all of our products. Now on Oregon Trail, we went a step farther, and that was we had an action game as one of the components, and that is the hunting game. And the action game just didn't work using that approach of AppleSoft calling a limited set of assembly language routines. So we had to get special permission from my supervisor to bring in an assembly language programmer, Roger Shimada, to program the hunting game. So the hunting game is 100% assembly language, and the rest of the product consists of a top layer of AppleSoft calling various assembly language routines. Now this makes an interesting contrast with another product I was working on at the same time, which was Word Munchers. And Word Munchers was our very first product that was 100% in assembly language, because the whole game is action.
MECC continued developing educational games throughout the 80s and 90s. In 1990, a Macintosh version of Oregon Trail was released. This game was just the 1985 version ported over. It wouldn't be until 1993 that MECC decided it was the right time technologically to develop a completely new version of Oregon Trail, a version much more along the lines of what Bouchard had wanted to do a decade before. Win Studer was the project manager for the 1995 Oregon Trail 2 game. I had the opportunity to also speak with him while making this video.
There was a core team of 4 people, right? So there was I was the instructional designer, and then Craig Conley, who was, I can't remember his exact title of it right now, but he was kind of like the producer. He was like the main guy who kind of herded all the cats together. So he was the kind of the main financial and technical driver behind it. So I was kind of the main driver in terms of content and design, but Craig was kind of the main driver in terms of everything else.
The new Oregon Trail game, released in 1995, was dubbed Oregon Trail 2. Immediately after starting the game, you see a drastic difference between the 1985 version and the 1995 version.
We expanded the trail a great deal. So, for example, initially it was strictly, in the older version of the Oregon Trail, was strictly going from Independence, Missouri to the Willamette Valley. It was just that one trail. With Oregon Trail 2, we expanded, put in additional trails. We put in the California Trail. We put in various cutoffs along the trail. So we expanded, the routes, that you could take. You had more choices. We also expanded the years. We expanded that to, I think, the whole range of years from 1840 to 1860. So you could pick the year in which you traveled. And of course, the year in which you traveled also affected the trails available to you, because some trails weren't opened up until certain times, until certain years. And so we greatly expanded the number of landmarks along the way. But with the Oregon Trail 2, with scores of landmarks. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it was like, pushing 100. A large number of landmarks that we stopped along the way. We also incorporated more characters into it that you could meet along the way. A great deal more ethnic and sexual diversity came into it. We had audio where you could talk to characters, that hear their voices talk to you. And we had a lot more music. We had authentic period music played on authentic period instruments. There's a whole lot of things got expanded. It was truly, a kind of quantum leap forward, to use a cliche there.
In Oregon Trail 2, your occupation choices increased dramatically. Hey look, teacher is actually listed below artist. And you can both name and pick the age of all the members of the party. The player also gets to choose what year to set out on, which range from 1840 to 1860. The year you choose affects numerous aspects of the game. Plus you have the option of where to start and where to finish. Studer and his team continue the tradition of programming computer algorithms into different features, such as the weather.
Weather is kind of a hidden algorithm that runs throughout Oregon Trail 2. We actually went back and we had meteorological data for those years, and whenever there was like a major occurrence. So, for example, I'm going to draw something off the top of my head. If we found that there was a trail diary and the people are at Chimney Rock on such and such day in history, and they say, "Oh, we had a terrible thunderstorm," we actually put in a terrible thunderstorm on that day at that location. Secondly, now, most of the time we didn't have actual historical data, so instead we used climactic data, actual climactic data. So you could say that, all right, in this part of the trail, along the way, we know that in June, here's the average temperature, here's the average low, here's the average high, here are the extremes, here's how often it tends to rain on that day. And so we brought in those algorithms to say that, all right, here are your odds, here's what is your likely average temperature, but then the extremes would radiate from that. So there's all these very complex weather algorithms going on.
This here's the Yukon Trail, an exciting new product from MECC.
There were several remakes and spin-offs in addition to these. The Yukon Trail simulates the Alaskan gold rush of 1897, and the Amazon Trail simulates heading up the Amazon River in search of the lost Inca village of Vilcabamba.
I am the Jaguar of the Inca King. We are hiding from the conquistadors in the secret city of Vilcabamba. We are sick with a fever. We need medicine that only you can bring. Follow me back in time through the blue mist, up the Amazon River to rescue my people.
The 10 combined versions of the Oregon Trail have sold over 65 million copies, making it arguably the most successful and profitable educational game of all time. In comparison, the original Super Mario Bros. Only sold 40 million copies, while Grand Theft Auto V has sold more than 75 million copies. But that's an episode for my After Dark series. In 1991, before Oregon Trail 2 had even begun, MECC's management had determined that they'd wanted to expand their place in the home market and develop new software across more platforms. To do this, however, required capital investment that the state of Minnesota was not interested in pursuing. As a result, the state of Minnesota cut all ties with MECC and it became the private corporation North American Fund II. In 1994, MECC became a publicly traded company with around $30 million in annual revenue. The 1985 Oregon Trail game was still bringing in $10 million a year for the company at that point. A year later, in 1995, when Oregon Trail 2 was released, SoftKey bought MECC for $370 million. Despite the huge success that Oregon Trail brought to MECC, ultimately the company shut down in October of 1999, closing their offices and laying off their staff. What impact did this game have on the gaming market? How about, what impact did this game have in the American education system?
Up to this point, MECC had never created a product for the home market. Everything was for the school market. And in schools, typically in those days, you only had a very limited number of computers. Each kid only would have a limited amount of time on the product. Most of the products were optimized for the students to get their full value out of it in maybe an hour or 2 hours. And that was it. The kids seldom got more than 2 hours exposure to any given product. In contrast, going to the home market, I knew I had to create something that would have somewhere between 20 and 40 hours of good play in it. One possibility was to create an adventure game. A typical adventure game, you just keep trying at it, you fail, keep trying at it, you fail, and it takes you maybe 40 hours to actually get all the way to the end. I didn't want to go that route. I wanted to do something where you could taste success much sooner than that, but then you could replay it. Every time you replayed it, you'd have a new experience. Something would be different about it. So it was then based on this idea of data-driven modules that would change according to the data, change according to the random events going on, all contributing to this idea of a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar every time you played it, so that you would enjoy that taste of familiarity but never be bored by it being the same as before.
In the 45 years since it debuted as a text-based program in a lone Minnesota history classroom to the numerous editions developed today, Oregon Trail made a lasting impact on millions of people over multiple generations. It was one of the earliest successful simulation games. So early, in fact, many didn't even refer to it as a simulation game. They classified it as an adventure game. So many people were exposed to this program, even those who never played any other computer game. This thing outsold Mario, and as far as numbers go, arguably rivals the latest Grand Theft Auto. Without a doubt, it's got to be one of the most well-known and successful educational games of all time across any platform. The keys that made it so successful were its qualities of randomness, which led to replayability. The key to any game gaining that kind of replayability is oftentimes giving the player a different experience each and every time they play. And Oregon Trail did that. If you're interested in playing the 1985 version of the game, emulators are available that will allow you to play on whatever modern computer you may have. I want to thank both Philip Bouchard and Wayne Studer for their involvement with this video. Philip's book, You Have Died Dysentery, is available for your electronic reading tablet and wherever actual books are sold. To get more insight than I covered today, I recommend checking it out yourself. And both podcasts with Philip and Wayne are available on my YouTube channel, One Man Films TN. Links are also provided in the description below. Well, that is it for this episode of The Bearded Nerd. Thanks for watching. Click the subscribe button to keep up with future videos, and feel free to write hateful comments below. See you next time.